What if I told you that the most important thing in your life, the paycheck you work for, the savings you cling to, the numbers in your bank app you think of as your money, might not be as real as you think? What if I told you that governments and central banks can summon that money out of nowhere, drain its value without touching a single coin in your hand, and still convince you to treat it as something sacred? It sounds like a conspiracy. It isn't. It's the system you live in, and the moment it quietly shifted into place has already passed, with almost nobody realizing what had just changed. The date was August 15th, 19. It was a Sunday night. President Richard Nixon appeared on American television, cutting into regular programming. His speech was calm, measured, almost technical. Among other policy moves, he announced that the United States would temporarily suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold. In practical terms, it meant this: foreign governments could no longer take their dollars to the U.S. and demand payment in gold. The promise that had underpinned the world's monetary system since World War II was being revoked. He called it an emergency measure. He called it temporary. It was neither. The gold window never reopened, and with that one decision, the link between money and a tangible anchor was severed. The U.S. dollar, followed by every major currency on Earth, stopped being a claim on real metal and became something different, a token justified by nothing except the authority of the state and the confidence of those who use it. To understand why that matters, we have to rewind. After World War II, world leaders gathered in a small town in New Hampshire to design a new financial order. The result was the Bretton Woods system. Under it, most currencies were pegged to the U.S. dollar, and the dollar itself was pegged to gold at a fixed rate, $35 for 1 ounce. On paper, this arrangement solved several problems at once. It brought stability to exchange rates. It gave investors and governments a clear anchor. It made the dollar the central pillar of global trade, and gold the foundation beneath it all. For a while it worked. But no system can escape its own contradictions forever. By the 1960s, the United States was spending heavily. The Vietnam War consumed billions. At home, new social programs expanded government obligations. Dollars flowed out across the globe as America imported goods, financed bases, and invested abroad. Foreign central banks accumulated those dollars. Under the Bretton Woods rules, they had the right to bring them back to the U.S. and ask for gold at the fixed price. The math stopped adding up. America held far less gold than the claims stacked against it. The promise that every dollar could, in theory, be converted into a small slice of Fort Knox had become impossible to keep. Countries began to test that promise. Some quietly exchanged their excess dollars for gold. Others threatened to. Pressure built. Behind closed doors, U.S. officials realized that if they continued to honor the old rules, they would ultimately drain their gold reserves and lose control over their own monetary system. So Nixon cut the cord. He didn't frame it as the end of an era. He spoke about defending the dollar, stopping speculators, protecting American interests. But in practice, the world woke up the next morning in a different monetary universe. By the mid-1970s, the transition was complete. The world had moved from money backed by gold to money backed by nothing more than decree. Economists called it fiat currency, from the Latin for let it be done. Money existed because governments said it existed. Its value was whatever they and their central banks could maintain. And for the first time in modern history, there was no built-in limit to how much could be created. What's striking is how quietly people accepted this. There were no lines outside grocery stores the next day, no riots, no runs on banks, paychecks still cleared, shops still sold food, life went on. But fundamentally, something had changed. Humanity had crossed a threshold into a system where trust, not scarcity, was the core of money. And when trust becomes the only anchor, history tells us the clock starts ticking. Because this was not the first time rulers had uncoupled money from real value. The Romans had done it long before. At the height of its power, Rome used silver coins as the backbone of its monetary system. The denarius was solid, widely accepted, and trusted. Over time, however, emperors facing rising military costs and political pressures discovered an easier way to finance their ambitions than raising taxes. They debased the coinage. Nero reduced the silver content of the denarius significantly. Rulers after him kept going, trimming the purity, lightening the weight, mixing in cheaper metals. By the time of the later empire, coins that looked like silver were mostly bronze with a thin silver coating. The consequences were predictable. Prices rose, ordinary people started to lose faith in the currency. True value hid in goods, land, or barter. Tax collection faltered, trade became harder. The empire didn't fall in a single moment, but the erosion of its money helped hollow it out from within. Centuries later, in China, a different experiment unfolded under the Yuan dynasty. Paper money. At first, it was brilliant, light, portable, easy to use across vast distances. A powerful innovation in a sprawling empire. But paper has one dangerous property. its supply can be expanded almost without cost. Faced with war, corruption, and growing expenses, the yuan rulers did what many rulers do when given a printing press: they used it. New notes were issued. Then more. Then more. Eventually, there were too many claims chasing too few goods. Confidence collapsed, prices soared, merchants refused to accept the paper. The monetary system disintegrated, contributing to broader unrest and decline. Different forms, different centuries, same temptation. Whenever those in power can separate money from something inherently scarce, they do. And when they do, they almost always cross the line from careful management into abuse. Nixon's move in 1971 wasn't a strange anomaly. It was another chapter in this recurring story. The difference this time was scale. Rome's debasement damaged an empire. China's paper experiments destabilized a dynasty. But the dollar in 1971 was already the backbone of global trade and finance. When it left gold, the entire system shifted with it. Other currencies floated. Central banks began to experiment actively with interest rates and money supply. Governments discovered they could run deficits year after year, rolling over their debts indefinitely, as long as investors believed. At first, it seemed liberating. No longer constrained by gold, central banks could cut interest rates to fight recessions and stimulate growth. Governments could spend to support employment, provide benefits, and pursue policies that would have been impossible under a harder standard. Inflation in the 1970s made the cost obvious. Oil shocks and easy money drove prices sharply higher. People watched their purchasing power erode. Savings accounts quietly lost value. But by the 1980s and 1990s, a new confidence took hold. Many economists and policymakers came to believe that central bankers armed with models, data, and interest rate levers could guide the economy like pilots steering an aircraft. They called it monetary policy. It sounded clinical, rational, sophisticated. In practice, it gave us cycles of cheap credit, asset bubbles, and crises, each one larger than the last. There is a deeper problem baked into this design. Systems built on ever-expanding money and credit are not static. They require growth to survive. Debt must be refinanced, old loans rolled over with new ones, asset prices must keep rising to justify the leverage placed upon them. The flow of credit has to expand, or the structure starts to strain. It's less like a stable foundation and more like a moving treadmill. Step off and you fall. Since 1971, global debt has ballooned to levels that would have seemed like fantasy beforehand. In the early 1970s, U.S. federal debt was in the hundreds of billions. Today it sits in the tens of trillions. Around the world, governments, corporations, and households have all ridden the same curve upward. Ordinary people feel this not in abstract numbers but in their daily lives. Look at prices over time. An ounce of gold fixed at $35 under Bretton Woods now trades at many times that. Average home prices that once sat in the tens of thousands now sit in the hundreds of thousands. Education, healthcare, and major life expenses have all climbed dramatically. Wages rose too, but for many, not fast enough. The result is a familiar sensation: working harder, saving less, and feeling like ownership is always just out of reach. And still, the system tells you this is normal. It also tells you there is no alternative. Once the dollar left gold, other major currencies followed. Europe, Japan, China, none are anchored to any fixed commodity. All are managed by central banks using similar tools, manipulating interest rates, expanding or contracting their balance sheets, and reacting to crises with injections of new money. The world now runs on a network of promises denominated in symbols that are not backed by anything tangible. The strength of that network depends on a single fragile ingredient: confidence. Confidence that tomorrow other people will accept the same units you hold today. Confidence that governments will keep paying their debts. Confidence that central banks will maintain stability. History makes one thing clear: confidence holds until it doesn't. Consider Weimar Germany in the 1920s. Crushed by war debts and reparations after World War I, German leaders resorted to the printing press. Initially, the approach seemed to work. Bills were paid, factories restarted, unemployment fell. But as more money was printed, prices became unmoored. In a few short years, inflation turned into hyperinflation. The cost of everyday goods rose so fast that wages had to be paid twice a day. Savings accumulated over decades vanished in months. Images from that era, children stacking banknotes like blocks, people carting cash in wheelbarrows, have become iconic for a reason. They capture how quickly trust in money can die once excess crosses a threshold. The economic pain fed political radicalization. Out of that instability, darker forces emerged. Or look at Argentina, a country that has lurched through repeated currency crises and sovereign defaults, overspending, money printing, currency devaluations, capital controls. The sequence repeats. Each time, ordinary citizens pay the price in lost savings and shattered plans. Over time, many Argentinians stopped trusting their own money. They save in dollars where they can. They turn to real estate, foreign accounts, or now, in some cases, cryptocurrencies. They adapt to a reality where the official unit of account is not a reliable store of value. This is what life looks like when money is stripped of credibility. Now, scale that risk up. Ask a simple question. If history shows that untethered money is vulnerable to abuse, why assume our current global system is immune? The United States is powerful, but not exempt from arithmetic. Europe, Japan, China each carries its own debts, demographic challenges, and political constraints. The structure built after 1971 is interconnected. If trust fractures in one major currency, the shock radiates outward. And yet, most people go through life without ever asking the most basic question: what is money? They treat it as if it were a law of nature, solid, permanent, unquestionable. But money is not gravity, it is an invention. Once it was shells, beads, or salt, then lumps of metal, then coins with reliable content, then paper that promised convertibility into metal. Now in most cases it's paper or digits with no convertibility at all. With each step, money has become more abstract, easier to create, easier to manipulate. We are now approaching the next stage: fully digital money managed directly by central banks. Central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, are being explored or developed in many countries. They are presented as upgrades, faster transactions, reduced costs, better monitoring of crime and tax evasion. But they also offer something else: an unprecedented degree of control. In a CBDC system, every official unit of money exists in a database overseen by the state. Every transaction is traceable. In principle, specific units could be programmed, allowed in some places, blocked in others, valid for certain purchases, invalid for others, subject to time limits or conditions. If today's fiat system already asks you to trust that money will hold its value, a CBDC system would ask you to trust that your access to it will never be restricted. Some see cryptocurrency as an answer. Bitcoin, created in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, was designed as a form of digital gold, limited in supply, governed by transparent rules, resistant to debasement by any single authority. In theory, it offers an exit from fiat inflation. In practice, it is still volatile, subject to speculative swings, regulatory risk, and adoption challenges. It may end up part of a future monetary mix, or it may remain a niche asset, a protest against central control, rather than a replacement for it. The point isn't to declare a single savior. The point is to recognize a pattern. Every time money drifts further away from something scarce, those in charge gain latitude. They can run higher deficits. They can promise more than they tax. They can smooth over crises with newly created units. They can postpone hard choices. And eventually, somebody pays. When bubbles burst, when currencies are devalued, when inflation erodes savings, it is rarely the most powerful who suffer first. It is wage earners, small business owners, retirees, those whose assets are denominated in the very units being quietly devalued. The day the dollar broke from gold in 1971 was not the birth of these dynamics. It was the moment they were globalized. So what do you do with this knowledge? First, you stop taking the system at face value. You stop assuming that because it has functioned in your lifetime, it must be sound. You question easy reassurances that debt doesn't matter, or that inflation is under control forever. You look at past episodes not to panic, but to see the range of outcomes history allows. Second, you invest in understanding. Economic literacy is not a luxury anymore, it's a survival tool. Knowing the difference between money as a medium of exchange, as a store of value, and as a unit of account helps you see where the cracks might form. Third, you think in terms of resilience, not perfection. No asset is magic. Gold can stagnate, real estate can fall, stocks can crash, cryptocurrencies can implode. But a mix of real assets, skills, and flexibility is far safer than blind faith in a single number on a screen. Because the real threat isn't just inflation or debt, it's complacency. History's message is blunt. When trust in money breaks, societies do not simply go back to how things were. They change dramatically. Political systems shift, social contracts are rewritten. The winners and losers of the old order are reshuffled. August 15, 1971, was the day the modern world quietly accepted that money no longer needed to be real in any physical sense. It was also a warning. Everything that feels permanent in a monetary system is only as durable as the trust that supports it, and trust, once lost, is hard to rebuild. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.